In the spring of 1945, Berlin was no longer a city, it was a wound. The heart of Hitler's Reich had become a hollow shell, a monument to destruction. Buildings that once towered with the pride of empire were now skeletal remains, their windows shattered, their streets scarred by bomb craters. The war that had begun with thunderous parades and promises of domination was ending in ash and silence. For years, the people of Berlin had endured the bombings. The sirens had become as familiar as church bells. Mothers no longer ran for shelter in panic. They simply gathered their children and walked to the basements like it was a routine chore. But in February 1945, something changed. The air raids were no longer just attacks. They were annihilation. That month, the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces launched a relentless campaign to crush the last of Germany's industrial and political might. Berlin, once the proud capital of Europe's most powerful war machine, had become the final target. The Allies wanted to send a message. The war would end here in fire. On the night of February 3, 1945, at 10:45 p.m., the first wave of bombers appeared over the city. Their engines echoed like distant thunder. Below them, Berliners barely stirred. Many believed the planes were heading for another city. They were wrong. As the bomb bay doors opened, the night sky blossomed into red light. Thousands of incendiaries fell through the clouds, glowing like embers. They landed on rooftops, streets, and rail yards. Within minutes, entire districts were burning. The firestorms merged into something almost alive, a roaring wind of heat and smoke that sucked the oxygen from the air. The flames leapt from building to building, devouring everything in their path. Civilians ran through the streets, their shadows dancing in the flickering light. The air was thick with dust and ash. Firefighters worked frantically, their hoses useless against the inferno. Somewhere near the Tiergarten, an elderly woman clutched a photograph of her son, a Wehrmacht soldier long dead on the Eastern Front. She pressed it to her chest as the flames closed in, whispering his name like a prayer. In the command bunkers beneath the Reich Chancellery, the mood was grim. Reports of destruction poured in, rail stations obliterated, hospitals hit, government buildings burning. Hitler's aides tried to reassure him, but the Führer knew the truth. The city was collapsing, and so was his empire. His orders grew more desperate. He commanded that every man, woman, and child fight to the last bullet. But outside, the people no longer listened. Their fight was no longer for Germany. It was for survival. The bombings continued for weeks. By March, Berlin was a city of ghosts. The Ones, Grand Unter den Linden, was littered with wreckage. The Brandenburg Gate stood amid a sea of rubble, its columns scorched. Refugees filled the subways, living underground to escape the endless raids. They slept on the cold stone floors, surrounded by the stench of smoke and unwashed bodies. When the sirens wailed, no one moved. There was nowhere left to run. Up above, Allied pilots flew their missions with grim precision. Many were barely out of their teens. They knew Berlin was heavily defended, but they also knew victory was near. From their altitude, they could see the fires glowing hundreds of miles away. The city seemed to be burning from within, like a dying star. Some pilots said the sight was beautiful in a terrible way. The clouds lit red and orange, the rivers reflecting flames like molten glass. Others turned away, unwilling to look too long. By April, the Red Army had reached the outskirts of Berlin. Soviet artillery opened fire on the city from across the Oder River. The bombardment was ceaseless. Shells screamed through the air and exploded in what was left of the neighborhoods. The Germans called it stunned nulls, 0 hour. For them, time itself had stopped. Civilians hid in basements as the Soviets advanced street by street. The air smelled of cordite and death. Each explosion sent dust raining from the ceilings. Mothers pressed their hands over their children's ears to drown out the noise. Above ground, the last defenders, Hitler Youth, old men from the Volkssturm, and wounded soldiers, fought with desperation. They manned anti-tank guns in the rubble, ambushed Soviet troops from shattered windows, and died by the hundreds. Meanwhile, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler held his final meetings. His generals argued over maps that no longer represented reality. Soviet troops were only blocks away. Outside, the city burned so fiercely that even underground, the air was hot and foul. Witnesses would later recall that the walls trembled constantly, as if the earth itself wanted to be rid of the war. On April 25th, Berlin was completely encircled. The Red Army had cut off all escape routes. The once mighty German capital was now a fortress of ashes. Ammunition was scarce, food was almost gone, and the wounded lay unattended in the streets. The hospitals had become morgues. The sky over Berlin, black with smoke during the day, turned red again at night, glowing from the endless fires. It was in those final days that many Berliners said the world ended. They remembered the light that filled the horizon, not the light of dawn, but of destruction. The sky burned crimson as bombs and artillery lit up the night. The sound of explosions rolled through the ruins like thunder. In the distance, the dome of the Reichstag was silhouetted against the flames, its once proud eagle collapsing into molten metal. For the civilians who survived, those nights became etched into memory. There were stories of people emerging from the basements after days underground, only to find their streets unrecognizable. A woman named Hildegard later recalled walking out one morning to find her entire neighborhood gone. The air shimmered with heat, and the sky was still red from the fires. It was like walking on another planet. She said, "The city I was born in no longer existed." The Soviet troops fought their way through the ruins, house by house. Each block was a battlefield. Snipers hid in attics. Grenades exploded in stairwells. The smell of smoke and blood was everywhere. As they advanced, Soviet soldiers saw the devastation wrought by years of bombing, charred bodies, collapsed shelters, families buried alive. Many were hardened by years of brutal fighting, but even they were shaken by the scale of destruction. Inside his bunker, Hitler refused to face the truth. He ranted about traitors and conspiracies, blaming everyone but himself. On April 30th, 1945, as the Red Army closed in, he took his own life. His death went unnoticed by most of Berlin. The city had stopped caring. Outside, the fires still burned, and the sky glowed red one final time. The battle did not end immediately. Fighting continued for several days as Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag and raised their flag over the ruins. When the gunfire finally ceased, Berlin was silent. More than 100,000 civilians had died in the battle. Entire districts had vanished. The Spree River was choked with debris. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. When the Soviet soldiers marched through the city center, they found a landscape of total ruin. Streets were filled with rubble, tram lines twisted like vines, and corpses lay where they had fallen. The survivors emerged slowly, dazed and hollow-eyed. They searched for family members, for food, for water. Some carried white cloths as signs of surrender. Others simply wandered, too numb to feel anything. For days, the fires continued to burn. At night, the glow could be seen for miles. Pilots flying over the region described the sight as haunting, a city reduced to embers, lighting the clouds from below. The sky over Berlin remained red for weeks, a grim memorial to the war that had consumed it. In the aftermath, Berlin became a divided ruin. The Allies occupied different sectors, and the city that had once been the center of power now became the symbol of a new conflict, the Cold War. But for those who had lived through those final months, the memories never faded. The sound of the sirens, the heat of the fires, the red glow that turned night into day, all of it lingered. In later years, historians would debate the morality of the bombings. Some argued they were necessary to end the war faster, to crush the Nazi regime beyond recovery. Others saw them as acts of vengeance, punishing civilians for the crimes of their leaders. But for the people who were there, morality was a distant concept. All they knew was survival. A British pilot named James Rowe would later recall that final mission over Berlin. He was 21 years old at the time when we reached the target. He said, "I looked down and saw the fires already burning. It was as if the whole city was one great torch. The clouds glowed red beneath us. I remember thinking, there's no way anyone could still be alive down there. And yet they were. They always were." In the ruins, life began to return slowly. Children played among the rubble, collecting bits of metal and broken glass. Women formed lines for food rations, their faces thin and weary. Men returned from the front to find nothing left of their homes. Yet somehow they rebuilt. Brick by brick, the city rose again from the ashes. By the 1950s, new buildings began to appear. Streets were cleared, and the scars of war were slowly covered. But beneath the surface, the memory remained. Berlin carried its past like a shadow. Every generation after would grow up knowing what their city had endured. How, in that final winter of 1945, the sky turned red, and the world seemed to end. Even today, if you walk through Berlin at dusk, there are moments when the light hits the clouds just right, when the city glows with that same reddish hue. Locals say it's just the sunset reflecting off the spree. But the old ones, the few who still remember, see something else. To them, it's not just a sunset. It's a memory, a reminder of the night when fire rained from the heavens and history itself burned. The war ended, but the story of Berlin did not. It became a story of ruin and rebirth, of guilt and forgiveness, of destruction and resilience. The city that had once been the heart of tyranny became the heart of remembrance. And though decades have passed, the image remains, a sky aflame, a city in ruins, and a world learning once again the cost of war. When the sky turned red over Berlin, it wasn't just the end of a war, it was the end of an era. The fires that consumed the city also burned away the illusion of invincibility, the belief that nations could wage total war and still remain whole. In those flames, humanity saw its reflection, powerful, destructive, and fragile. Berlin rebuilt, the scars faded, but the story endures. In the cobblestones, in the memorials, in the silence of the people who still remember that night. For them, the sky will always be red.